Yes, okay. Welcome to our eighth. I always look at Dan when I say the number, and it is eight. I know that our eighth conversation on co-production, and this week it's an absolute privilege to welcome Professor Diana Rose to our little crew. Unfortunately, we've not got Liz with us. She's otherwise engaged, but Diana, it's great to have you with us. Thank you so much for giving up your time to speak to us. And as always, we invite our guests to introduce themselves. So the floor is yours. Would you mind saying who you are and what you do, and we'll pick it up from there.
My name's Diana Rose. I come from Aberdeen. And I was one of those lucky kids in the late 60s who was able to go to university and get everything paid for. It doesn't happen anymore. So I've had psychiatric issues, mental health challenges since I was 20, like for 50 years. And one of the things, although had academic careers, I've also had, well, you said living in the community, but the thing that saved me when I was living in the community was getting involved in survivor politics, really. And then that's like, I have this history of user involvement back in the days of asylum closures. Sometimes I go back thinking what it was like then, and it wasn't nice. Some managers would say, like, why should I listen to a manic depressive like you? Those kind of comments. But some of it was quite good, and some of it was effective in practical things like getting people decent housing that are coming out of the institutions. But how far have we come, in a sense? I mean, the paper that I wrote with J. Street Callahill, we were reflecting on all these involvement activities that have been, the engagement activities that have been in policies, in research, and this issue of power, but not just power between people, but power of certain discourses and power of certain expertises, and the way they're in a hierarchy within the academy. Well, you must know about that. But they're also a hierarchy between the academy and every other kind of knowledge. And I suppose we don't think that co-production can happen, until you stop, you people like you stop having capacity to lock us up, but also until those other forms of knowledge are as valued as, I mean, I don't think it's like divesting yourself of expertise is one thing, but you can't deny that you have expertise. For me, the important thing is that other people's expertise is acknowledged as valuable as yours, and how you make that happen practically is a really hard question, I think. I don't think people can. Yes, you can own your power, and part of your power lies in your expertise, but you can't deny that you have that expertise. Just where does that expertise lie on the hierarchy or the jigsaw or whatever of knowledge with the people that you're working with, involving, engaging, collaborating, co-producing. I mean, these are all signifiers they're almost empty signifiers, in that they can mean so many different things. I mean, I have sat in a room with somebody who runs a very hierarchical research team, starting to say, we do co-production, but nothing's changed. It's just a new word to gloss over the, do you see that? It's just badging it the same thing differently. And then other people try really hard to grapple with the dominant forms of knowledge that devalue other forms of knowledge, and yeah, people try really hard, and there are really practical things, but there are also, it's very difficult to see that you are thinking in a certain way. You can't help it because you're like part of this knowledge economy, really. Yeah.
There's this thing around being part of that knowledge economy, part of that institution of the academy in its widest sense. And even if you do have that way of being, which is more co-productive and less hierarchical, inherently one still has to a degree, play the game to live, survive and progress within that tradition, within the traditions of the academic institution, because that's the way those rules are set up for career progression, for winning of funding, for, oh, thank you, George. Okay, thank you. Sorry about that interruption.
It's good. Rich shows it's live and not scripted, Joe.
For production of papers, all of that stuff is embedded within the very fabric of that kind of hierarchical system. So it's almost impossible to escape.
And the way the funding's set up as well.
I mean, I think you're absolutely right, and I have done things I am not proud of. I didn't know that I was climbing the greasy pole. I mean, when I went to King's, I was on 1 year rolling contract for 6 years, and then I got a senior lectureship, which was kind of open-ended, but not really. And then, yeah, I didn't. You know, the thing you can think that you are collaborating on something that is worthwhile. And then it gets to the point where you realize that actually it's not worthwhile. You are being used. And it's very difficult to articulate, but I think it's important to own up that you can get people like me, who are supposed to be the other side, can get drawn into this discourse and drawn in to an extent to the metrics of grants and publications and all the rest of it. And then you suddenly realize, maybe not for everything, but for particular projects, that like this is really bad science. And yes, and you are there as basically a token. So yeah, I don't think it's like that whole university thing is very, it's seductive, and it's also bloody hard to, you know, write the papers and get the grants and everything. And I think the last few years, for me, I've just felt I'm going to write what I want to write. And if they don't like it.
Does that come with, when you were, what was it that freed you up to just write in that, or behave within the academic structures and confines of that, to behave in that slightly freer, less constrained way?
I got a big grant, which pleased them immensely. And because I got made a professor, I thought, you know, seriously, once you got there, you can then divest yourself of, because yes, I have, you know, appraisals, and they're full of metrics. They have a graph of the average at your grade and you, in terms of, in the different color. You know, you are metricized, you are measured. But yeah.
At the other end of the scale, where you started off talking about kind of practical things that you can do, or one can do, to not divest oneself of power, but to recognize and value the power, the expertise that others bring, and to kind of enable them to see the power that they have in their own expertise.
There are really basic things that people have to be recognized and rewarded. you know, if they're going to be involved in this kind of thing, you are being paid for doing what you're doing. Some kind of recompense, whatever, if they're on benefits, whatever is allowed, it's like kind of fundamental, I think. Because otherwise there is a basic inequality. And I know it's hard to get the money and find a way to do it. And yes, we have to do it all through payroll now, and it's a pain in the neck, but I think it's fundamental. I really do. Because
I do think it's still really interesting that this structural kind of impediments to that happening are still there, because it does kind of talk to that historical thing that you refer to explicitly in the paper around how these things are kind of talked up as being really important, but then actually the things that allow them to happen still aren't kind of there.
I know. I mean, that would imply that the last 35 years has made no difference. And I think that would really be a terrible thing. I think we're in a very bad place right at this moment. Nationally, there was this program within NIHR called Involve. It's gone. Involvement in NIHR hasn't gone, but that central infrastructure doesn't exist anymore. And I think that's, I mean, it wasn't, you know, it had many, many drawbacks in that, yes, user involvement in research. But even if you're involved in the design of a research, certain things count as research. Even if it's qualitative research, you have to collect your data, you have to interpret your data, or run it through a statistical program, or do it in en vivo, or just do it by highlighting. But there are steps of research, and service users who are involved can't change that, because the PI can't change it, because then, you know, that's the way that the structure of research inhibits real change, I think. It's in the methods, because methods everything in English, this kind of world. So that, yeah. So I think that's one of the reasons why. Sorry, am I talking too much?
No, completely the opposite. No, it's fascinating. I think you know, it's really interesting. So we are going through this very practically at the moment with the AWRC. We have a public interest in research group, you know, that was set up to, as I mentioned, our research centre is physically located in a community of disadvantage, economic disadvantage. And I think how we talk about these communities, I'm trying to be really careful about, because
I know
I really dislike the term deprived, because it immediately presents a deficit view, and then, you know, when you have conversations, you come with a preconceived idea about what that might mean. And, you know, when you meet people and you listen to them, they're far from deprived. It just means they're not got enough, as much cash as maybe somebody else has. Or and for me, the idea of this was about, and even though we are physically located there, we are not part of that community.
Now, what do you think would make, why aren't you? But what's the reason that, what do you mean when you say we are not part of that community? Okay,
so what I mean is that I should probably rephrase that and say the community has no, at the moment, perceived no social capital or influence over that space. And so it's almost the other way around, really. And what would be success for me is not that we have influence in the community, but the community has influence over us.
Yes.
And so that's where I'm trying to get to. And the way I think we can do that is by, as you've described it, recognizing and enrolling. And so there is a whole HR process we're going through. There is a whole payments process that we're going through.
Tell me about it.
And actually the university's been, you know, supportive of that. But the fact that we have to set that up tells you something. But equally, the other bit about recognition and reward is, and I'd not looked at it this way until one of my colleagues challenged me on it, is we also need to make sure we have enough, in inverted commas, work for them to do to recognise their value in the contribution, because that is just as important. And so there's
that's interesting, because if you say that implies that sometimes you might not have enough work for them to do. So what is the kind of work that you think they can't do, I think is the question. Why is this work that I would say marginalised communities myself, and then the whole language thing. Yeah. But what is it about this kind of work that you're talking about that somehow marginalised communities can't do it? Or could they be doing something else that would help it? Would be the way that I would put it, I think.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think that was the conversation about, well, what do we mean by this? You know, do we mean in the sort of, traditional, perhaps, PPI, here's a grant, review that, tell us what you think. And, whatever you say, we've already formed an opinion anyway, but we just want that to tick the box. Or do we mean, let's have a conversation about what matters most to you. Let's start to listen. Let's create meaningful ways to do that. Let's do it on your terms, not ours. So, we're inviting you at times that suit you, not suit us.
Why don't you go there?
Yeah, well, exactly. Yeah. And we do. I mean, we do through the anchor institutions that are there, but equally it's being on that, how to describe it, challenging that culture and the traditional way of doing things within the institution.
Yes, but that's
authentic. Yeah.
There's a limit to how much you can change it and still count as being what you are. Because if you were to change it completely, you would no longer, you wouldn't count as a researcher. That's a dilemma.
I wonder if this is where, it goes back to what you said earlier, Diana, about the processes of the scientific method. In a sense, you collect data in this way and it goes into SPSS or some other program and gets analysed and what have you. There are methods in other disciplines, non-scientific disciplines that don't use science, where there is perhaps a more blurred boundary between what is rigour, in methodological rigour, and what is something that lay people, non-academic people, can engage with as a technical process of research. And
I think that there are.
This is one of the things where I wonder whether there is one of the values of interdisciplinarity in terms of bringing sciences in line with maybe design and arts-based methods that can act as this bridge between, that enables people to engage in scientific research through design methods or through arts-based methods. And I don't know what you thought about that, whether that was something you'd experienced or you had any thoughts?
I mean, I'm a failure at anything artistic, I'm afraid. But I mean, in terms of, yes, of course, there are other kinds of methods. So you were trying to find out people's sense of their community physically. That there are things that you could do. You could do like a walking interview or a peer walking interview, which would just be a conversation, but walking through the community, and then people will talk about the places that, well, one thing people will talk about are the places that feel safe and the places that don't feel safe, or places that have good memories for them or places that have bad memories for them. And that's, that's a completely different way. It still counts, but it's not, do 10 interviews a day and get them in, and that with structured questions. It's a very different, But that probably doesn't work for you, but that's just an example. Yeah. Or one thing that I came across, this which is more community development, is that you draw a river, and then people talk about where there are, what do you call them? Where there are boulders and rocks that are obstacles. A river with a goal, where there are rapids, where the river is smooth. So that you're thinking about it, people are thinking about it, maybe in terms that make sense to them, maybe it doesn't, but there are alternatives. And I think I think the way we've been trained to do research in this scientific space is very distant. It's really very distant from the way people live.
I think that's really interesting. I mean, it resonates with a lot of things that we've talked about and a lot of stuff that Joe and I have done around, I guess science is designed to make science sound like it's scientific and sound like it justifies itself. So it focuses on methods that scientists are comfortable with, and that kind of reinforces itself. And I guess what you're describing here is actually making these methods accessible to people to be involved in ways outside of the kind of traditional scientific methodology. So yeah, we've used lots of visual techniques to allow people to use metaphor to express themselves in different ways. And we've often found that by making using visual representations, you can support individuals to be far more articulate about a subject, because it is quite hard.
You use photo voice?
We've used kind of variations on photo voice. I know a couple of people, including colleagues in public health in Rotherham and other places, who've done the whole thing. We quite often use, we were looking at a public health intervention around how we could better use a lake in Doncaster. We just happened to have a lake hanging around. And one of the things we did was we kind of invited people, the kind of key stakeholders, so people who lived in that area, worked in that area, kind of Doncaster Rovers had a say in this, so we got their kind of team. And we all walked around this space because we'd spent ages talking about what we could and couldn't do in this area. And then we actually walked around. It was really interesting by sharing that experience and actually attending and taking photos of sections, like you said, that looked welcoming or didn't look welcoming. When we all kind of came back and kind of had a chat about it, we got a far better and shared understanding of things than we would have done if we just sat and talked about footfall or any other kind of traditional metrics that we use to.
I think it's a kind of participatory research, and you're blurring, aren't you, in doing this? You're blurring what we call data collection and what would be called analysis.
Absolutely.
The blur
intentionally
between intersectionality and between the two. But the people, I don't quite know what you mean by key stakeholders, but these persons were involved in all stages, of walking, a representation of the lake, not the actual lake.
No, we walked around the actual lake.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
But I think there is something really interesting there, isn't there? Because this separation out of data collection and analysis, and I think Joe and I have talked about this a lot, around kind of people talk about focus groups as being co-production, and they're not. They're just a glorified interview with more people in them. And I know the focus group purists will tell me there's a really very complicated methodology around that, but actually you're still taking data off people, then you're running away and hiding in a darkened room doing your clever stuff with that data.
It's extractive.
And I think actually we found that you get much richer understanding, much richer knowledge by doing that process with the people who are offering up that knowledge in the first place, because you can.
Yes, I mean, I think that's where I would make a plea. I would make a plea for users as researchers, and user-led research. Because yes, a focus group can just be a big interview, or it can be much more dynamic. When I've done focus groups on particular topics, I always disclose to the people that I have some of the same experiences, not all the same. I've been hospitalized, I've been sectioned a lot, ECTs, I have even had insulin coma treatment in 1970. You know, so, and I think that makes a difference if people know that you, yes, sometimes they forget and think you're a psychiatrist, you know, but it makes a difference if you tell people that although you have some kind of control in this space, you share a lot of experiences, not exactly, but you share a lot of experiences with them. And that I think that changes the dynamic.
Are these kind of strategies that in your paper you talk about how we might get into the third space, as you call it? Are these some of the kind of...
Homi Bhabha's third space. Yes, they are. And I think what we were saying was that the very structure of, this is mental health, of mental health services, and also the nature of research and the Eurocentric discourse that overarches it. Obviously there are lots of nuances and things, but basically, you know, post-Renaissance, the mad couldn't think, and neither could Black people. So that's how we were positioned. And I have arguments with my partner about this because he said it's not true anymore. You know, people listen to you, blah, blah, blah. But there's still these things like, you know, you don't have insight, you don't have capacity. There is something cognitively the matter with you. That, all right, they're not saying you can't reason, but it's still legacies of that. And I think when there are, I mean, take, for example, the Dan, is it? Was it the sports? Who's the sports one?
Oh.
Okay. So trying to do physical fun type stuff with people with mental health problems. I mean, what do you do about the fact that they're doped up? You know, that's always people are talking about is very important, and it is for people who have serious mental illness to get fit and to be doing physical things. And they never say, the professionals never say, but there is an enormous problem, which is these people are on medication that makes them sleep sometimes 16 hours a day and they're never properly awake. And that is an obstacle in that. And even just acknowledging that it's going to be hard and acknowledging that this medication has really strong effects, I think would be an important thing to do. Because then you're giving them an experience. You're acknowledging that their experience is both really important, and it's something that, you know, some people welcome it, others hate it. Most people hate the side effects, of which sleepiness is one. This is people's experience, and you're acknowledging that, and you're acknowledging that therefore it's going to be hard, you know, to do anything physical. I put that front and center, and it never is. I know, I've been like that.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah. The workshops that we ran around mental health and physical activity were really interesting, partially because the group that we work with, I think, were quite happy to share and quite happy to point out when we made mistakes, which was great because we made shed loads. So they felt that was good. And the important things were, so just around physical activity was, exercise was a kind of almost a no-no. There was a real kind of sense of, and we kind of used this later on, we kind of had this kind of on a good day or a bad day. And on a bad day, the idea of exercise might be that between watching episodes of something on telly, you try and make sure you went up and down stairs. And that kind of, we got that real sense of the enormity of the challenge of instigating these things in those situations. But on a good day, people might be up for a walk around the park or to go and access a kind of formal exercise somewhere with support. I think listening and really attending to what people were telling us made a big difference into how we conceptualize the whole kind of movement mental health idea.
I think you also, sorry.
No, go on.
I think you also have to, like, what is it? What is this exercise?
Yes.
What is it? Because it's not just exercise. If people are doing it in a group, like even walking in a group, it's not just the walking, it's the chatting. It's the basic form of peer support that people are getting from being together. And if the experts think it's just exercise, they're missing. You're missing what the experience is. I think for
No. Well, we did that as well. So we thought, we know the benefits of being sociable. And people say, well, on my bad day, I don't want to be sociable. It was constantly kind of exploring kind of what is kind of what the knowledge says is a good thing, and then what people felt like. And so this was the idea that we could have one kind of program that suited everybody. Really, really interesting. We used kind of stuff 5 ways to wellbeing to help people think about different activities and how it might have an impact. We did an exercise where we kind of looked at all sorts of different exercise, and people chucked some in the bin, like running, and or moved them to we got them to kind of do prioritizing stuff. And it was really interesting because we managed to start people moving away from writing, jogging, walking, to a bit of housework or cooking or all these other kind of activities that meant you moved more. Somebody's got to patent that thing.
Write that down. What, move more?
Move more, Rob. So that really helped kind of break down the fact that we weren't coming with a particular agenda, and it was really set by the people in the room. So again, that kind of listening and participation.
Am I just telling you things you're doing already?
No, not at all. Not at all. We made lots of mistakes as well, which I know we talked about last week about sharing mistakes, but
and very, very practically. I mean, we will absolutely. I love the idea, and we can implement this of some of these walking interviews around the communities. I think we've done in the past. We've looked at street audits. But they're quite mechanistic,
Yes, they are. So are the apps.
Yeah, how many of these, how many of those, where, and actually you don't get into the sort of deeper narratives about the where the value is for people, and almost the inherited value of what they perceive matters most in that community from their lineage and their context and their culture, and those are the sorts of things that actually influence.
Those are the kinds of things that I'm missing from the kind of research that is done in our kind of space. It's just the individual ripped from their social context and kind of intervened on with no context at all, and just completely daft. Because the context is everything. Not everything. But if you don't take into account adversity, as well as whatever resilience is, if you don't take into account racism, if you don't take into account, homophobia, all like different kinds of adversity, multiple adversities and marginalizations that people experience, then you'll understand nothing.
I think that's so true. I think whilst it's not everything, I think without context, you do have nothing.
With the work that did you say you were a psychologist?
Yeah.
That was my first degree. The work that people do, clinical psychologists, their research is individuals on their own being given sessions of CBT about themselves. You know, I don't understand how people can, I really don't, can think that that makes any sense. I think
it comes back to then. I don't necessarily want to go down that route, but it comes down to where the power is, doesn't it? In that, and where the expertise is, and
I think that's one of the things in that paper that we were trying to say, is that especially in the West, and it's been configured differently throughout history, but you know, cogito ergo sum, the individual, especially the educated individual, you know, it's like you're by yourself and you do it all. And yeah, I just thought it's part of that legacy of that whole post-Renaissance kind of thing, that we think of society as made up of individuals, not of individuals as made up in society. Yeah. I mean, that's a very abstract way of putting it. That.
There's a great paper I came across recently called Justice is Care, which talks exactly about that, and how even the legal system that we have as inherited talks about and reinforces individual rights, as if the individual alone is the paramount kind of thing, whereas actually we are all vulnerable people that depend on relational qualities with which to kind of define ourselves and work and live and survive within the world, for all of us. It doesn't
even have to be, you don't even have, I mean, whatever vulnerable is, we are all situated in different kinds of social relational context, some much more privileged than others, all of us are. You know, in a way.
If there was, within kind of going back to the sort of academic institutions and the way that they impede research with people, non-academics, what would you point to as being the one thing that maybe above all others has to really change to enable that to happen on a more kind of widespread basis, kind of trying to achieve this promise of co-production?
Well, I think going back to what you were saying, I think it's got more and more difficult with the way the whole metricization of the academy, the commodification of academic work, and the bureaucracy that, I don't know what yours is like, that's kind of Byzantine thing that has grown up around it. There are real challenges. If I would just go back to what I said before, if I could change one thing about universities, it would be to make it very easy to pay members of the public to be involved. You know, get stuck into payroll and show them why this is important. I know that sounds ridiculous, but it's so difficult, to pay people.
I think there's something really important in that, because recently when we tried to submit a proposal that had a non-academic co-investigator, the funders were more receptive to that than the university itself. And I think there's something significant about that.
So with the promise of finishing on time for once in our conversation series, and it might be appropriate that it's coming to the final one of the season, are there any final sort of thoughts that you would want to perhaps, or questions or challenges that you would want to present to us, Diana? I mean, I've put you on the spot there, but I'm just intrigued.
I suppose I'm wondering what you mean, I think whoever said it, by key stakeholders, and why engage key stakeholders rather than, well, you know, ordinary folks. So that sounds like that's a little bit patronising, but you know, that's the route through key stakeholders will then shape the people that you are able to talk to.
Yeah, it's probably just my poor description. So
sorry.
For key stakeholders, I meant the right people who should be in the room at that time.
Okay.
So,
but there is a tendency to say, well, we get the chairs of the organisation.
Yeah, no. That's never my never my approach, unfortunately. So it was actual people who lived in that area who were keen
That's
to.
Quite nice then.
Yeah, keen to contribute.
Sorry, Dan.
No.
I was going to say is what I find also really interesting, particularly when we're talking about interventions, and we'll have a conversation that says, well, we need to get the key decision makers engaged. And ultimately for me, the key decision makers in any intervention are the ones whether they decide to take part or not. It's not the ones who are going to commission it. It's not the ones who are going to design it. It's not, the ones who are going to evaluate it. The key decision makers are actually the people that are going to be engaging in it. And I think that to me speaks to almost the heart of the way the system is structured, and where is an emphasis on the wrong part of the system. And yes. I think if you audited who are key decision makers on interventions or on commissioning or on these sorts of things, that balance would be out of kilter. And I think it's perhaps a narrative and a language that we perhaps need to start to rewrite that starts to create.
Yes, I mean, I think that's a terrible picking it. The whole idea of an intervention, is something that some people do to other people. But you need to think of a different way of describing this. It's like, we want to change whatever in whatever direction. And it will make a difference, the people you're talking about who will participate. If you have some kind of advisory group, that it's been shown that will make a difference to the numbers of people and the type of people who you're talking about and should be the real decision makers. And the nature of the research as well, if they're going to be that, has to allow it. They can't be a randomized controlled trial, sorry.
You won't get an argument from us on that one.
No.
You're not talking to the right scientists for that one.
No. I think I'm speaking to the converted, actually.
Well, I think converting in terms of that being a process, I think there's some really interesting things here about language and description that is unconscious or learned or adopted without thought.
But they carry so much baggage that you don't know, and they carry some baggage for you. Use them with other people, and they're like,
Well, I think what I find fascinating is we're so careful to potentially carry other language from different parts of our life, not into a certain work context, and yet how careful are we with the language that we use within our work context about these sorts of principles? That's actually
there's a lot of
challenge to me, actually.
It's a lot of untraining today, but at the same time, I go back to where I started. I don't think you can see. It's not that you want to divest yourself of your expertise. It's you want to make sure that everybody else's expertise is valued in the same way in terms of the contributions making to whatever it is you're doing.
Could I add to for me, I think that perhaps there's something more than just valuing the expertise that individuals bring. I think it's something about valuing the whole contribution beyond. So whether it's emotional investment or intellectual investment or, practical experiential investment. I think recognizing as a whole, because so much of this can be reduced to, the contribution as being their expertise is just experiential, just experiential.
Exactly. And anyway, what is experiential knowledge? My experience is different from yours. It's a collective thing. Surely.
Yeah.
And I think, again, that's something that is going.
Right. Well, Joe, you close for us.
Yeah, I'm going to struggle to do justice to that in 30 seconds. That's been an incredible opportunity to speak to you, Diana, and I want to thank you for your time.
Yeah.
I think that insight into the kind of both the individual mechanisms by which researchers can be more conscious of these issues to do with power in their relationship with non-academics in the work they do, but also very aware of the larger societal and institutional kind of structures, and navigating the way between the two at the moment. Until we can change those institutional structures, we have to work within it, but it takes a real conscious effort to kind of navigate that space in between without becoming normalized to those ways of disempowering people.
It's exactly the risk of becoming normalized within this space.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think that's a really big challenge to throw out to all academics, regardless of whether they are currently involved in sort of participatory work or not. And I think that kind of consciousness, raising the consciousness of the power that one has, even if, you know, your intentions are good in this respect.
Exactly. Yeah. Nobody's saying everybody's nasty people.
Yeah.
And some people are, but you know, it's all these assumptions. I agree with everything you said, but I think the other side of it has to happen at the same time, because that consciousness won't be raised enough unless you have other knowledges to compare it with and to value.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you. That's been incredible. Going to let you get off to enjoy your retirement in France now, and I'm sure we've all got kind of tea and supper and family things now. It's reaching 5:30. Thanks for your time.
Yeah,
well,
thank you.
Really nice talking to you all.
Yes, you too. Yeah, thanks for your time. Yeah,
Okay.
great stuff.
Bye.
And, yeah, speak to you soon.